Dorothy Wilson had always been a careful driver. At 72 years old, she prided herself on never having received a single traffic ticket in over 50 years of driving. Her friends at the community center often teased her about being too cautious, but Dorothy believed it was better to be safe than sorry. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Dorothy woke up at 6:30, made herself a cup of coffee, and checked her grocery list twice. She had written everything down in her neat handwriting the night before. Milk, bread, eggs, her favorite brand of cereal, and the special heart-healthy margarine her doctor recommended. Living on a fixed income meant she had to be smart about her shopping, and Dorothy never left home without a plan. After breakfast, she grabbed her worn leather purse and car keys. The same purse she had carried for nearly a decade, a gift from her late husband Robert. It held everything important to her: her driver's license, insurance cards, a small bottle of diabetes medication, some cash, and a photo of her 3 grandchildren. Dorothy always kept her important papers organized in the front pocket, a habit that had served her well throughout her life. The drive to Peterson's Market took about 15 minutes from her small apartment. Dorothy loved this particular grocery store because the staff knew her by name and always helped her reach items on the high shelves. The store had been part of the community for over 30 years, and it felt more like visiting friends than running errands. As she pulled into the parking lot, Dorothy noticed it was busier than usual for a Tuesday morning. She drove slowly through the rows of cars looking for a good spot. Her aging Honda Civic wasn't the prettiest car in the lot, but it was reliable and paid for. That's all that mattered to her. She finally found a space near the front of the store, right next to a police car. Dorothy felt a little nervous parking so close to an official vehicle, but it was one of the few spots available. She carefully pulled in, making sure to leave plenty of room between the cars. The last thing she wanted was to cause any problems. Shopping took Dorothy about 45 minutes. She moved slowly through each aisle, comparing prices and checking her list carefully. The young cashier, Tyler, helped her bag the groceries and even offered to carry them to her car. Dorothy politely declined, saying she could manage just fine. Independence was important to her, even if simple tasks took a little longer than they used to. Walking back to her car with her cart, Dorothy felt satisfied with her shopping trip. She had found everything on her list and even spotted a good deal on canned soup. As she loaded the groceries into her trunk, she hummed a song she remembered from her youth. That's when things started to go wrong. Dorothy was backing out of her parking space when she heard a sickening scraping sound. Her heart dropped as she realized what had happened. In her concentration on loading groceries, she hadn't noticed how close she was to the police car next to her. Her rear bumper had scraped against the side of the patrol vehicle. Panic washed over her immediately. Dorothy had never been in any kind of accident before, not even a minor one like this. Her hands shook as she put the car in park and tried to figure out what to do next. She could see a small scratch on the police car's door, and her own bumper had a matching scrape. Officer Bradley. Mitchell was inside the store buying his usual morning coffee and energy drink when he heard someone call out that there was an incident in the parking lot involving his patrol car. At 43 years old, Mitchell had been a police officer for 15 years. He had seen his share of accidents, break-ins, and various calls, but he particularly hated dealing with parking lot fender benders. They always seemed to take forever and involved way too much paperwork. Mitchell walked outside and immediately saw the elderly woman standing next to her car looking distressed. He could see the minor damage to his patrol vehicle. Nothing serious, but damage nonetheless. His mood was already sour from a difficult shift the night before, and this wasn't how he wanted to start his day. Dorothy saw the officer approaching and felt her anxiety spike. She had always been intimidated by authority figures, even though she had never done anything wrong in her life. Her mind raced as she tried to remember what she was supposed to do in this situation. Insurance information, she thought. She needed to get her insurance information. "I'm so sorry, officer," Dorothy said as Mitchell reached her car. "I was being so careful, but I guess I didn't see how close I was. I've never had an accident before, and I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do." Mitchell looked at the damage on his patrol car and then at Dorothy. He could tell she was nervous and genuinely sorry. But that didn't make the situation any less inconvenient for him. He would have to file a report, contact his supervisor, and deal with getting the car repaired. All of this would eat into his day and create more work. What neither Dorothy nor Officer Mitchell realized was that someone else had noticed the commotion. Danny Rodriguez worked at Peterson's Market and had been collecting shopping carts in the parking lot when he heard the scraping sound. As a 24-year-old who had grown up with social media, Danny's first instinct when he saw any unusual situation was to record it. Danny pulled out his phone and positioned himself behind a row of shopping carts where he had a clear view of the scene. He wasn't trying to cause trouble or create drama. He was just curious about what would happen and thought his friends might find it interesting. In his generation, recording everyday events was as natural as breathing. From his vantage point, Danny could see both the elderly woman and the police officer clearly. The woman looked upset and was digging through her purse, probably looking for her insurance papers. The officer stood with his hands on his hips, looking impatient. It seemed like a routine accident that would be resolved quickly and peacefully. Dorothy finally found her insurance card in her purse, though her hands were shaking so much she almost dropped it. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind many times over the years, worried that someday she might need to know what to do, but actually being in this situation felt completely different from what she had imagined. "Here's my insurance information," she said, holding out the card to Officer Mitchell. "I take full responsibility for this. I should have been more careful backing out." The parking lot around them was relatively quiet, with only a few other shoppers coming and going. Most people glanced at the scene but continued with their own business. It looked like any other minor traffic incident that happened thousands of times every day across the country. But this particular morning, in this particular parking lot, things were about to take a very different turn than anyone expected. Officer Mitchell took Dorothy's insurance card, but barely glanced at it before handing it back to her. His expression had grown more serious, and Dorothy could sense his impatience growing by the minute. She had hoped this would be a simple exchange of information, but something in the officer's tone made her feel like she was in much bigger trouble than she thought. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from your vehicle," Mitchell said, his voice carrying an authority that made Dorothy's stomach flutter with nervousness. "We need to properly document this incident, and I have some questions for you." Dorothy nodded quickly, wanting to cooperate in every way possible. She had always respected law enforcement and wanted to make this process as smooth as possible. But as she stepped away from her car, she realized she was having trouble hearing exactly what the officer was saying. Her hearing had gotten worse over the past few years, especially when people spoke quickly or in lower tones. "I'm sorry, officer. Could you please speak a little louder?" Dorothy asked politely. "I'm having trouble hearing you clearly." This simple request seemed to irritate Mitchell even more. In his experience, people who claimed they couldn't hear him were usually just trying to buy time or avoid answering his questions directly. He had dealt with plenty of people who tried to play games during traffic stops, and he wasn't in the mood for it today. "I said step away from your vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them," Mitchell repeated, this time speaking much louder and more forcefully than necessary. Dorothy was startled by the sudden change in his volume and tone. She moved further away from her car, confused about why this seemed to be escalating into something more serious. In her mind, this was just a simple accident between two cars in a parking lot. She couldn't understand why the officer was treating her like she had committed some kind of serious crime. From his position behind the shopping carts, Danny continued recording on his phone. What had started as a routine fender bender was beginning to look like something more interesting. The police officer seemed unusually aggressive for such a minor incident, and the elderly woman looked increasingly confused and frightened. Danny had seen enough police encounters on social media to recognize when things might be heading in the wrong direction. His finger hovered over the stop button on his recording app, but something told him to keep filming. He had a feeling this might be important later. "Now, I need to see your driver's license and registration," Mitchell continued, his patience wearing thin. "And I need you to explain to me exactly what happened here." Dorothy fumbled in her purse again, her hands shaking more now from nervousness than from age. Finding her license was more difficult. When she was stressed and everything seemed to be scattered around in the bottom of her bag, she pulled out her wallet, then her medication bottle, then some receipts, but couldn't immediately locate her license. "I know it's in here somewhere," she said, her voice getting smaller as her anxiety increased. "I always keep it in the same place, but I'm just a little nervous right now." Mitchell watched her dig through her purse and interpreted her difficulty as stalling tactics. In his mind, Every interaction was potentially a situation where someone might be hiding something or trying to deceive him. He had been trained to look for signs of deception, and in his current mood, everything Dorothy did seemed suspicious. "Ma'am, how much have you had to drink today?" Mitchell asked suddenly. The question hit Dorothy like a physical blow. She looked up from her purse with shock and confusion written across her face. The idea that anyone would think she was drinking was so foreign to her that she couldn't immediately process what he was asking. "Drinking?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Officer, I don't drink alcohol. I haven't had a drink in over 20 years. I just had coffee this morning before I came shopping." But Mitchell had already decided that her reaction looked suspicious. Her confusion seemed like an act to him, and her nervous behavior was reinforcing his belief that something wasn't right about this situation. He had made up his mind that this wasn't just a simple accident. "You seem disoriented and you're having trouble following simple instructions," Mitchell said, his voice getting harder. "I'm starting to think there might be more going on here than just a parking lot accident." Dorothy felt like the world was spinning around her. Nothing about this interaction made sense to her. She had accidentally scratched a police car, she had apologized immediately, she had offered her insurance information, and now she was being accused of drinking. Her heart was racing and she could feel her blood pressure rising. "Officer, please," she said, trying to keep her voice calm and respectful. "I understand you're just doing your job, but I promise you I haven't been drinking. I'm just nervous because I've never been in an accident before, and I'm having trouble hearing you clearly because of my hearing problems." Her explanation only seemed to make things worse. Mitchell took a step closer to her and Dorothy instinctively took a step back. She wasn't afraid of being hurt, but his presence felt overwhelming and intimidating. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to perform some field sobriety tests," Mitchell announced. "Put your arms out to your sides and walk in a straight line." Dorothy stared at him in disbelief. Field sobriety tests were something she had only seen in movies and television shows. The idea that she was being asked to perform them in a grocery store parking lot felt surreal and humiliating. "Officer, I really don't think that's necessary," she said, her voice starting to shake. "I scraped your car by accident and I'm happy to pay for the damages through my insurance. But I haven't done anything that would require sobriety tests." Several other shoppers had begun to notice the commotion. An elderly man loading groceries into his truck stopped to watch. A mother with 2 young children in her cart paused on her way into the store. Even some of the store employees had come outside to see what was happening. Danny adjusted his position slightly to get a better angle with his phone camera. He could tell that the situation was getting more tense, and he wanted to make sure he captured everything clearly. The elderly woman looked genuinely distressed, and the police officer seemed to be treating a minor accident like a major criminal investigation. Dorothy looked around and noticed that people were watching her. The embarrassment of being the center of attention in such a negative way made her feel sick to her stomach. She had lived in this community for over a decade, and she shopped at this store regularly. These people knew her as a quiet, law-abiding senior citizen, and now they were watching her be treated like a criminal. "Please, officer," she tried one more time, her voice now clearly shaking with emotion. "Can we just exchange insurance information like normal people do after a minor accident? I don't understand why this has to become such a big situation." Her plea for reasonableness only seemed to anger Mitchell further. In his mind, her reluctance to comply with his request was proof that she was hiding something. He had convinced himself that there was more to this story than a simple parking lot accident. Mitchell reached for his radio, and Dorothy felt a wave of panic wash over her. She didn't know what he was calling for, but she had a sinking feeling that this situation was about to get much worse than she could have ever imagined. The morning that had started so normally, with such simple goals, had somehow turned into a nightmare that Dorothy couldn't wake up from. And unfortunately for her, the worst was yet to come. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms and news channels around the world. But in that moment in that parking lot, it was just an elderly woman trying to understand why a simple accident had spiraled so completely out of control. Dorothy watched with growing alarm as Officer Mitchell spoke into his radio. She couldn't make out what he was saying, but his tone was serious and official. Other shoppers had stopped what they were doing to observe the scene, and Dorothy felt exposed and vulnerable under their stares. "Officer," she tried again, her voice barely steady. I really think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I just want to handle this accident properly and go home." Mitchell finished his radio call and turned back to Dorothy with an expression that had grown even more stern. Whatever he had discussed with dispatch had apparently reinforced his belief that this was more than a routine traffic incident. "Ma'am, I've called for backup because you're being uncooperative," he said, his voice carrying a tone of finality that made Dorothy's heart sink. "I need you to place your hands on the hood of your car and spread your feet apart." Dorothy stared at him in complete shock. She had seen police shows on television where officers made people assume this position. But those were always criminals or suspects in serious crimes. The idea that she was being asked to do this felt so wrong and frightening that she couldn't immediately process it. "Officer, please," she said, her voice now clearly trembling. "I think there's been a terrible mistake. I'm not a criminal. I'm just a grandmother who accidentally scraped your car. I have diabetes and all this stress is making me feel sick." But Mitchell had already decided how this encounter was going to go. In his mind, Dorothy's continued attempts to reason with him were just further proof that she was trying to manipulate the situation. He had worked himself into a state where every word she spoke seemed like an attempt to deceive. I am Dorothy's mention of her medical condition should have been a red flag that caused any reasonable officer to step back and reassess the situation. Instead, Mitchell interpreted it as another excuse designed to gain his sympathy and avoid consequences. Danny, still recording from behind the shopping carts, felt his stomach tighten as he watched the scene unfold. He had started filming out of casual curiosity, but now he realized he might be documenting something much more serious. The elderly woman looked genuinely terrified, and the officer's demands seemed completely out of proportion to what had happened. "I said place your hands on the hood of your car," Mitchell repeated, his voice rising to a level that carried clearly across the parking lot. Several more people had stopped to watch, and some were beginning to look concerned about what they were witnessing. Dorothy's hands were shaking so badly now that she could barely control them. She reached into her purse one more time, hoping to find something that might help resolve this situation. Maybe if she could find her medical information or some other form of identification, she could convince the officer that she was exactly who she claimed to be. This simple action triggered the most devastating moment of the entire encounter. As Dorothy pulled her hand out of her purse, the bag somehow slipped from her grasp. The contents scattered across the asphalt in what felt like slow motion. Her medication bottles rolled under nearby cars. Her insurance papers fluttered in the slight breeze. Coins bounced and rolled in different directions. The photograph of her grandchildren landed face down in a small puddle. The sight of her personal belongings spread across the dirty parking lot pavement was somehow the breaking point for Dorothy. All the stress and confusion and fear of the past several minutes came crashing down on her at once, and she began to cry. "Oh no," she said, dropping to her knees to try to collect her scattered belongings. "Oh no, oh no, oh no." For Officer Mitchell, Dorothy's accidental dropping of her purse was the final straw. In his state of mind, it looked like a deliberate act of defiance or possibly an attempt to distract him while she disposed of evidence. His training had taught him to be suspicious of any unexpected movements or actions during police encounters. Without warning, Mitchell grabbed Dorothy's arm and pulled her roughly to her feet. The sudden physical contact and force shocked Dorothy so completely that she cried out in pain and surprise. She had never been handled roughly by anyone in her entire adult life, and the officer's grip on her arm was firm and painful. "You're under arrest," Mitchell announced loudly enough for everyone in the parking lot to hear clearly. The words hit Dorothy like a physical blow. Under arrest for what? For accidentally backing into a parked car? For asking questions? For having trouble hearing? For dropping her purse? None of this made any sense to her, and the unreality of the situation made her feel like she was trapped in some kind of horrible nightmare. "Please don't hurt me," Dorothy said through her tears. "I don't understand what's happening. I don't understand what I did wrong." But Mitchell was no longer listening to anything she had to say. He had mentally committed to this course of action, and he was going to see it through regardless of how inappropriate it might be. He forced Dorothy's hands behind her back, causing her to wince in pain as her arthritis-affected joints were twisted into an uncomfortable position. The metallic click of handcuffs closing around Dorothy's wrists was heard clearly by everyone watching. Several people in the crowd gasped audibly. Danny's hands were shaking as he held his phone, but he kept recording. knowing instinctively that what he was capturing was important. "This is for resisting arrest and disorderly conduct," Mitchell announced, as if he needed to justify his actions to the growing crowd of onlookers. Dorothy stood there in handcuffs, tears streaming down her face, completely unable to comprehend how her simple trip to the grocery store had resulted in her being arrested. Her medication was scattered on the ground. Her groceries were still in her car. Her purse contents were spread across the parking lot, and she was standing in front of people she knew from her community, being treated like a dangerous criminal. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and their mood was beginning to shift from curiosity to concern and even anger. Several people were now openly expressing their disapproval of what they were witnessing. "That's not right," one woman said loudly enough for Officer Mitchell to hear. "She's just an old lady who had a little accident." "This is ridiculous," added an elderly man who had been loading groceries. "I've seen that woman in this store for years. She's never caused trouble for anybody." But Mitchell was too committed to his course of action to back down now, even in the face of clear community disapproval. He had made his decision, and his pride prevented him from admitting that he might have overreacted to the situation. Danny continued recording, his heart pounding as he realized he was documenting something that would likely have serious consequences for everyone involved. He had never intended to become a witness to what appeared to be a clear case of police misconduct, but that's exactly what had happened. Dorothy stood in the parking lot, handcuffed and humiliated, wondering how her simple life had been turned upside down in the span of less than an hour. She couldn't have imagined that her routine grocery trip would end with her being arrested, but that's exactly what had happened. And thanks to Danny's quick thinking with his phone camera, every moment of this injustice had been captured in high-definition video that would soon change everything for everyone involved. Danny's hands were still shaking as he stopped recording and quickly saved the video to his phone. He had captured nearly 8 minutes of footage, from the initial conversation between Dorothy and Officer Mitchell all the way through her arrest. As he watched Dorothy being led to the patrol car in handcuffs, he knew he had documented something that people needed to see. The first thing Danny did was send the video to his girlfriend, Rachel, with a message that said, "You're not going to believe what I just witnessed at work." Rachel watched the video immediately and was horrified by what she saw. She had grown up in the same community and knew Dorothy by sight from the grocery store. The idea that this sweet elderly woman had been arrested for a minor parking lot accident seemed impossible to believe. Within minutes, Rachel had shared the video with several of her friends, asking them what they thought about the situation. The reaction was immediate and unanimous. Everyone who watched the footage was outraged by Officer Mitchell's behavior. They could see clearly that Dorothy had been cooperative, apologetic, and confused, while the officer had escalated a minor situation into something completely unreasonable. By the time Dorothy was processed at the police station and released on her own recognizance 3 hours later, the video had already been shared dozens of times among friends and family members throughout the community. Each person who watched it had the same reaction: this was wrong, and people needed to know about it. Dorothy's daughter, Patricia, received a call from a friend while she was at work, telling her that her mother had been arrested. Patricia initially thought it was some kind of mistake or misunderstanding, but when she saw the video that was now circulating through their social circle, she was shocked and furious. Patricia immediately left work to pick up her mother from the police station. She found Dorothy sitting in the waiting area, still shaken from her experience and confused about what had happened to her. Dorothy's belongings had been returned to her, but she looked smaller and more fragile than Patricia had ever seen her. "Mom, are you okay?" Patricia asked, wrapping her arms around Dorothy. "I saw the video." "Everyone's seen the video. This is unbelievable." Dorothy didn't even know there was a video until Patricia told her. The idea that someone had recorded her humiliating experience made her feel exposed and embarrassed all over again. But Patricia explained that the video actually proved that Dorothy had done nothing wrong and that the officer had completely overreacted. While Dorothy was trying to recover from her traumatic experience, the video was spreading far beyond their local community. Danny had eventually posted it on his social media accounts with the caption, "Police officer arrests elderly grandmother over minor parking lot accident." The video immediately started gaining traction, being shared by people who were outraged by what they were seeing. By evening, The video had been shared hundreds of times and viewed by thousands of people. Comments were pouring in from viewers expressing their anger and disbelief. Many people were tagging their local news stations, asking them to investigate the story. Others were sharing it with police reform advocacy groups and civil rights organizations. Officer Mitchell, meanwhile, had completed his shift and gone home, completely unaware that his actions were being scrutinized by a growing audience online. He had filed his incident report, describing Dorothy as uncooperative and potentially impaired, and had noted that she was arrested for resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. In his mind, he had handled a difficult situation appropriately and professionally. The first sign that something was wrong came when Mitchell's supervisor, Sergeant Linda Hayes, started receiving phone calls from community members asking about the arrest of Dorothy Wilson. Initially, Hayes assumed these were just routine inquiries from concerned citizens, but the volume of calls was unusual for such a minor incident. By the next morning, the video had exploded across multiple social media platforms. It had been viewed over 50,000 times and shared by thousands of users. Local news stations had picked up the story, and reporters were trying to contact both Dorothy and the police department for comment. The video's spread accelerated when it was shared by several accounts with large followings. A popular local influencer shared it with her 20,000 followers, expressing her outrage at the treatment of an elderly community member. A police accountability advocacy group with a national following shared it as an example of unnecessary force and poor decision-making by law enforcement. Comments on the video were overwhelmingly supportive of Dorothy and critical of Officer Mitchell. Viewers pointed out how patient and cooperative Dorothy had been throughout the encounter. They noted her obvious confusion and distress. They highlighted how minor the original incident had been, and how completely inappropriate the officer's response was. "This breaks my heart," wrote one commenter. "You can see how scared and confused she was. There was absolutely no reason to arrest this woman. I hope this officer faces consequences for this abuse of power," wrote another. "This elderly lady was trying her best to cooperate, and he treated her like a dangerous criminal." The video also caught the attention of Dorothy's neighbors and friends from her apartment complex and community center. Many of them had known Dorothy for years and could vouch for her character. They began sharing their own stories about her kindness and community involvement, painting a picture of a woman who was the opposite of the troublemaker Officer Mitchell had described in his report. By the end of the second day, the video had been viewed over 200,000 times. It had been picked up by regional news stations and was being discussed on local radio shows. The hashtag #Justice for Dorothy had begun trending in their state, and people were demanding accountability from the police department. The police department's phone lines were overwhelmed with calls from concerned citizens, media outlets, and advocacy groups. The department's social media accounts were flooded with comments about the video. The pressure was mounting for an official response to the incident. Dorothy, meanwhile, was struggling to cope with the sudden attention. She appreciated that people were supporting her, but the idea of being the center of such a controversy was overwhelming for someone who had lived a quiet, private life. She had never wanted to be famous, especially not for something like this. Patricia helped her mother navigate the media attention and connected her with a civil rights attorney who specialized in police misconduct cases. The attorney, David Chen, watched the video and immediately recognized that Dorothy had a strong case against both Officer Mitchell and the police department. "Mrs. Wilson," Chen told Dorothy during their first meeting, "what happened to you was completely unacceptable. The video clearly shows that you were cooperative and posed no threat whatsoever. This officer violated your civil rights and there need to be consequences." As the video continued to spread and gain national attention, Officer Mitchell finally learned about its existence when Sergeant Hayes called him into her office. Mitchell watched the footage with growing horror as he realized that his version of events was completely contradicted by what the camera had captured. The video showed clearly that Dorothy had been polite, cooperative, and confused throughout the encounter. It showed that she had not been uncooperative or disorderly. It showed that Mitchell had escalated the situation unnecessarily and had used excessive force against an elderly woman who posed no threat. Mitchell's carefully written incident report suddenly looked like a work of fiction when compared to the objective evidence of the video. His career, his reputation, and his future were now in serious jeopardy because of decisions he had made. During what should have been a routine parking lot accident, the power of modern technology had turned a local incident into a national conversation about police accountability, the treatment of elderly citizens, and the importance of video evidence in exposing the truth. Dorothy's terrible day had become a catalyst for change, even though all she had ever wanted was to buy groceries and go home. 3 weeks after the incident, Dorothy sat in her living room watching the morning news with a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. The story about her arrest had grown far beyond what she ever could have imagined. The video had been viewed over 2 million times, and her case had become a symbol of police reform movements across the country. The investigation into Officer Mitchell's conduct had moved swiftly once the video evidence became undeniable. The police department's Internal Affairs Division had reviewed the footage and immediately recognized that Mitchell's actions were indefensible. His incident report, which painted Dorothy as uncooperative and potentially impaired, was completely contradicted by the video evidence. Chief of Police Robert Anderson held a press conference 5 days after the video went viral, announcing that Officer Mitchell had been suspended without pay pending a full investigation. Anderson acknowledged that the department had failed Dorothy and the community, and he promised that changes would be made to prevent similar incidents in the future. Mrs. Wilson was clearly the victim of an inappropriate use of force and poor decision-making, Chief Anderson said during the press conference. The video evidence shows conclusively that she posed no threat and was attempting to cooperate throughout the encounter. We apologize to Mrs. Wilson and her family, and we are committed to ensuring that this never happens again. The criminal charges against Dorothy were dropped immediately once the video evidence was reviewed. The district attorney's office issued a public statement acknowledging that the charges had been inappropriate and apologizing for the distress caused to Dorothy and her family. But for Dorothy, the vindication came at a significant personal cost. The stress of the arrest and the subsequent media attention had taken a toll on her health. Her blood pressure had spiked dangerously high in the days following the incident, requiring a brief hospitalization and adjustments to her medication. The psychological impact was even more significant. Dorothy, who had always felt safe and secure in her community, now felt anxious and vulnerable whenever she left her apartment. Simple tasks like grocery shopping, which had once brought her joy, now filled her with dread. She worried about encountering police officers and feared that she might somehow find herself in trouble again. Patricia had taken time off work to help her mother cope with the aftermath of the incident. She handled media requests, coordinated with the attorney, and provided emotional support as Dorothy struggled to understand how her quiet life had been turned upside down. "I just wanted to buy groceries," Dorothy told a reporter during one of the few interviews she agreed to give. "I never wanted any of this attention. I just wanted to handle the accident properly and go home to my apartment." Her words resonated with millions of people who watched the interview. Dorothy had become an unintentional spokesperson for elderly Americans who felt vulnerable and powerless in the face of authority. Her dignity and grace, under pressure, had made her a sympathetic figure who transcended political and social divisions. The video had also sparked important conversations about how police officers are trained to interact with elderly citizens and people with disabilities. Dorothy's hearing difficulties and diabetes, which should have prompted compassion and understanding, had instead been interpreted as suspicious behavior by Officer Mitchell. Police reform advocates used Dorothy's case as an example of why officers need better training in de-escalation techniques and working with vulnerable populations. The incident highlighted how quickly routine encounters can spiral out of control when officers approach situations with suspicion rather than service-oriented mindsets. Officer Mitchell's fate was sealed when the internal investigation concluded that he had violated multiple department policies and had used excessive force against Dorothy. The report found that Mitchell had failed to properly assess the situation, had escalated tensions unnecessarily, and had arrested Dorothy without legal justification. Mitchell was terminated from the police department 6 weeks after the incident. The termination letter, which was released publicly, cited his grossly inappropriate conduct and failure to serve the community with the professionalism and respect that citizens deserve. But Mitchell's troubles didn't end with his termination. The district attorney's office announced that he would face criminal charges for assault and violation of civil rights under color of law. These were serious felony charges that could result in significant prison time if he was convicted. Dorothy's civil rights attorney, David Chen, filed a federal lawsuit against both Mitchell and the police department, seeking damages for the physical and emotional harm Dorothy had suffered. The lawsuit alleged that Dorothy's constitutional rights had been violated and that the police department had failed to properly train and supervise its officers. The lawsuit sought compensation for Dorothy's medical expenses, emotional distress, and the loss of her sense of security and well-being. More importantly, it demanded policy changes within the police department to prevent similar incidents from happening to other vulnerable community members, and the community response to Dorothy's case had been overwhelmingly supportive. Peterson's Market, where the incident had occurred, established a scholarship fund in Dorothy's name for local students studying social work or criminal justice. The store's management also implemented new policies for handling incidents in their parking lot, including better training for employees on when and how to document events. Danny Rodriguez, the store employee who had recorded the video, was initially worried that he might face consequences for filming the incident. Instead, he was praised by community leaders and civil rights organizations for his quick thinking and courage in documenting the truth. The video he captured had provided crucial evidence that would have otherwise been unavailable. If Danny hadn't recorded what happened, it would have been Dorothy's word against a police officer's, Chen explained during a community meeting. This case shows how important citizen journalism can be in holding public officials accountable for their actions. The case also prompted the police department to implement new policies regarding body cameras and incident reporting. All officers were now required to wear functioning body cameras during interactions with the public, and supervisors were required to review footage from any incident that resulted in an arrest. Training programs were expanded to include specific modules on working with elderly citizens, people with disabilities, and individuals experiencing medical emergencies. Officers were taught to recognize signs of confusion, hearing difficulties, and medical distress, and to respond with patience and understanding rather than suspicion. For Dorothy, the journey toward healing was gradual and ongoing. She eventually returned to shopping at Peterson's Market, though she now went with Patricia or friends rather than alone. The store employees always greeted her warmly and went out of their way to make her feel welcome and safe. She also began speaking occasionally at community events about her experience, though she never sought out the spotlight. When she did speak, her message was always the same. She hoped that what happened to her would prevent other elderly people from experiencing similar treatment. "I'm not angry anymore," Dorothy said during a speech at her community center. "I just want to make sure that other grandmothers and grandfathers are treated with dignity and respect. We all deserve to feel safe in our own community." 6 months after the incident, Officer Mitchell pleaded guilty to the criminal charges against him and was sentenced to 1 year in jail and 3 years of probation. The plea agreement also required him to complete anger management courses and community service. The civil lawsuit was settled out of court for a significant amount that allowed Dorothy to feel financially secure for the rest of her life. More importantly to her, the settlement included provisions requiring the police department to implement comprehensive reforms in training and oversight. Dorothy used some of the settlement money to establish a legal aid fund for elderly citizens who experienced similar problems with law enforcement. She wanted to ensure that other seniors would have access to legal help if they found themselves in situations they couldn't handle alone. Incident that had begun as a simple parking lot accident had ultimately led to meaningful changes in how the police department operated and how the community thought about accountability and justice. Dorothy's courage in the face of injustice had made her neighborhood a better place for everyone. Though she never wanted to be famous, Dorothy Wilson had become a symbol of dignity, resilience, and the power of truth. Her story proved that even the most vulnerable members of society deserve respect and protection, and that technology could be a powerful tool for exposing injustice and demanding accountability. Most importantly, Dorothy's experience showed that ordinary citizens have the power to create extraordinary change when they stand up for what's right, even when doing so requires great personal courage and sacrifice.